Hello, everyone, and especially attendees of Ropecon 2021. My name's Evan Torner,
And I am Jukka Särkijärvi.
and we are here to talk about recent academic books on tabletop RPGs. Are we able to see that all right? So, uh, who are we? We've introduced ourselves, but who are we really? Um, I think to present myself in brief, I'm a very long time game master who then wound up writing a lot of articles and editing at least several volumes on role-playing games. And in this capacity, I'm also associate editor at International Journal of Role Playing and an editor at Analog Game Studies. Yuka?
Yeah, I am also a very long time game master, and for my sins, I am the role-playing games administrator of this convention. Additionally, I've edited five non-fiction books about role-playing games and LARP over the years.
Yeah, and so to some degree, we're speaking as people who have never written one of these longer monographs that we'll be reviewing today. But at the same time, we as editors have to see a lot across our desk. And I've been reading Yuka's posts on various aspects of RPG scholarship for years and years. So hence the idea for the panel. What are we going to be talking about?
Yeah, well, the past few years have been a very fruitful time for role-playing game scholarship, and over the past 3-4 years, there's been a bunch of books coming out, PhD theses, essay collections, monographs, and we thought it might be fun to take a look.
Yeah, and I represent sort of this subfield now of I guess multiple different disciplines called role-playing game studies. And in order to really motivate me to read through all of this stuff, I needed to have like an end outcome, and this was a perfect end outcome. So the big question is why? Why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we doing this to ourselves?
Because we are academics, and this is to us fun.
Yes, that is the number one answer. I think we had an enjoyable time, kind of going through everything. But also, this is in celebration of this scholarship, and also we're a bit humbled by the fact that it's so interdisciplinary. I don't really think either of us have the full academic tool set to apprehend the whole dimensions of most of the books, right? So to some degree we can evaluate the role-playing game parts, but then when they talk about psychology or something, it's like, well, I'm not a psychologist. And so it's important to emphasize that we're talking about certain dimensions of the book and not others, because we just don't have the expertise to talk about those other dimensions.
Yeah, for the record, my expertise is in English literature.
Admirable. And this is of course my own expertise is in German studies, and then I also have film studies and game studies specializations as Yuka in the game studies department. So okay, how are we going to go about doing this? Well, we didn't want to take up too much of your time, so we decided we're going to slam our way through 10 books in in less than an hour, and that's what we're going to do. So Leonardo DiCaprio is looking at us incredulously, but really we are going to go through all 10 of these books. And the format is we're going to state a few things about them, and some notes we've had from each book, and try to summarize what we got out of them in less than 5 minutes apiece. So, without further ado, do we want to get started?
Probably, yeah. One thing though, this isn't even everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, you co-edited a book during this time that we're not reviewing, partially because you're in it, and I'm in it. So it.
Yeah. And the textbook role-playing game studies from I think 2019 is excluded. You're in it.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. There was a big textbook called Role-Playing Game Studies, a transmedia approach, edited by Jose Zagal and Sebastian Deterding. Shout out for an excellent book. And of course, I'm in it in 4 different chapters, so I can't review that. So one factor in the selection was, did either of us edit and or publish in that particular book?
Also excluded was one book that came out, I think, this month. There was no time, and our program description, I believe, mentions Watch Us Roll, edited by Shelley Jones, uh, which isn't out yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, Shelley's book, and that's one that I'm in, so it maybe disqualifies it anyway. But it's also a book on digital streaming culture and RPGs. Very interesting, but I don't know what else is in it other than my essay. So that will be for the next time we have a omnibus grouping of this literature. All right, let's get started.
Yes.
We're gonna go chronologically. So, all right. Thanks for permission to go ahead. We are going to start again with Renee Reinhold Schalliger's "The Postmodern Joy of Role-Playing Games," which is from 2018. Agency, Ritual, and Meaning in the Medium. I reviewed this book in the American Journal of Play, so I can kind of go from my text there. This is a book that's coming in, definitely from the discipline of game studies, but as informed by, I would say, the German or Germanophone academic literary world. So I described this as follows. I said, to Schalliger, role-playing games or RPGs are sites at which postmodern achieves social and narrative expression. Indeed, as the title of the book suggests, the participants in such games experience postmodern joy, the pleasure of seeing language as procedural rather than factual, as always interrupted and contingent rather than fluid, explanatory, and coherent. So Schalliger valiantly argues for the inclusion of role-playing games as a 20th century medium of literary merit. These texts would be aspirationally be filed under the Postmoderne section of a tome such as the J.B. Metzler's Deutsche Literaturgeschichte, with Schalliger's monograph listed in the footnotes. But in other words, his monograph is, I think, concerned with the institutional legitimacy of role-playing games studies within the fairly rigid nationalistic literary studies establishment as currently conceived in Germany, Austria, and other European countries. So to kind of put a point on it, this is speaking to Germanists and others is invested in that kind of literary sphere where terms like the postmodern have a lot of currency. They don't have a lot of currency in other other areas such as game studies right now, and that it legitimates this as a field of study for them. It talks to that audience. What do you think, Jukka?
Well, it yeah, it doesn't really add a lot to us as game role-playing game scholars. It I think one useful thing about it is that since it explains a lot of stuff to an outside audience, it does summarize, for example, every other preceding role-playing game studies book published by McFarland.
Yes, it does. Yes, that's very useful actually. Is that McFarland is one of the oldest publishers that's been dealing with role-playing games in a serious fashion again since Daniel Mackay's book in 2001. And RPGs as performing art. And I was thinking, too, it is good to have books that speak to powerful people that say what we do is legitimate, but also I really like his notion that RPGs are fiction about fiction, where we're producing new fiction that's already kind of collecting other fiction, and I'm happy that we have that kind of formulation in a book somewhere. And one critique, of course, is that it treats what we call GNS theory, gamism, narrativism, simulationism theory, as kind of sacrosanct rather than highly disputed. And I'd love it if that were disputed more often in book level publications. Oftentimes, people want to explain the theory, but the theory is not accepted in the larger community in many cases. Any final words, Yuka?
Not at this point. Let's move on.
Let's move on. I agree. Our next book would be Usfa Saragina's Performing Fantasy and Reality in Contemporary Culture. Please ignore the dead name on the cover. Saragina's book does this great, I think, balancing act between different disciplines. So they're covering business, psychology, theater, experience design, moving from the kind of origins of what we consider to be performance through to the communities that we build around LARP, live action role play. And I think it really does collect, theory, practice, and subculture into one great book with terrific writing and acuity. There's also a lot of interviews in it, which spice it up for me. I think it's a good primer book for those academically interested in LARP. There's David Simpkins' The Arts of LARP, and others books, and I think this one is, ranks on that level of being able to introduce the hobby to everybody. And for those who want to bounce around between advanced theory and just simple descriptions of what is going on in a LARP, Saragina's book will not lead you astray.
Also, for my part, I consider it the most detailed description of specifically Finnish LARP as practiced. And it was at times a kind of difficult for me to read because I recognized so many things and got flashbacks.
You were there. You were there, Jukka.
Oh yeah,
This is not all the time could you read the book and say, "Oh, I saw what happened."
yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if we've ever actually played together, but we've certainly played some of the same LARPs with Usma.
So one thing that this book needs is a ludography to some degree, really to uh, nail down that these were the LARPs that they played on these dates, and to some degree, that's not something we're going to get.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell something from the photographs, such as the Siikalahti historical LARPs are very recognizable in there,
Yeah,
but it's not a ludography.
I think we will leave a link to in the comments about where you can find the full book with all the photographs, because this Routledge published version doesn't have all of the photographs.
Well, I think it does, but it's black and white.
That's why I was like, well, it might as well. I don't know if the photographs were worthy of being included here,
But
but
yeah, one thing, this is based on their PhD dissertation, which is available for free and in color. This is from an art studies background, so there is a lot of art that they created uh, about the topics of the dissertation, and they're beautiful.
And I'd like to close out by saying that this was a book that, to some degree described my life, even though I was not in Finland at the time, where since 2010, there's an interviewee in the book, Sue, who says that LARP friends also become your friends, and you notice how it happens through the characters you play. And this will be a phenomenon we describe in the community as known as bleed, but also I think that strong sense of community is what keeps us coming back despite any hiccups, which Saragina also goes into. I appreciate that the hobby is described with warts and all, because that's the way that we can keep advancing it. Shall we move on?
Let's.
Okay. Mika Loponen's The Semiospheres of Prejudice in the Fantastic Hearts, The Inherited Racism of Irrealia and Their Translation. So Loponen's book is a thesis. It's effectively about orcs, goblins, and gnomes, right? And dwarves as well. And these are all fantasy races, but we can also say they draw from and are proxies for real people and also real race relations. Um, he comes up sort of with a sweeping analysis of what he calls irrealia, which I looked up and I think that really is Mika Loponen's term. Uh,
Yeah.
and so he himself coined this term, I think, back in 2009, and then deals in the rest of the dissertation with the semiotics of otherness. And I think that it's covering a very hot and very present topic. in global RPG discussions. What do we do with this term race that's so central to Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role play? But again, he's approaching it from the angle of semiotics. And I think the bait and switch thing is that this is not totally a semiotics dissertation. This is a cultural studies dissertation. Loponen goes into the cultural roots and the long-standing stereotypes and the kind of popular culture images associated with these particular um, fantasy races. So I think actually, I went in saying semiotics, what, and then came out thinking, no, I now know kind of the history of where do we get the orc, where do we get the goblin, how racist was Tolkien, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, since it is mostly cultural studies work, it also makes it very accessible. There isn't a whole hell of a lot of complicated theory, so this is readable for everyone. And it really is, since it is a PhD dissertation from the University of Helsinki, and the link is in the comments. It's a free download because information wants to be free.
Information wants to be free, and what I actually like is that it parallels other freely available information on race and racism in RPGs, some by James Mendez Hors and Daniel Kwan, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of ongoing critique of race in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, and this is, of course, not merely an academic discussion. This has been discussed in mainstream media. Actually, this specific book has been discussed in mainstream media in Finland, and it pissed off a lot of people on the right side of the aisle at the parliament.
Isn't that a good thing?
Yes, it is.
Far out. Yeah, I think the book is, parallel to a couple of other English language publications that are also looking at race in games. But I know Mika Loponen spent a long time on this book, and you can kind of tell with the care that's there throughout. And again, I do think that ultimately this contributes a very definitive takedown of Tolkien, definitive kind of broadcasting of the anti-Semitism in the idea of the dwarves, and kind of the longer genealogical impact of his creations than over the 20th century fantasy sphere. But I'm still tossing and turning in my sleep about what irrealia are. I felt like I read it and then I thought I understood it, and now I woke up this morning and said I still don't understand it.
It's I think it parallels Darko Suvin's concept of the novum, and it's the stuff in the fantasy story that's not real, like elves and magic, as opposed to the realia, which is like horses.
Yeah, yeah, right. You can imagine horses because you've probably seen a horse, and then they exist in our world, but you've not seen an elf. That's a fair summary.
Yeah, but don't quote me on that. It's been a couple of years since I read it.
Yeah, that's fine. We're not too formal here, so we will move on from here to
That's
number 4, tabletop role-playing games and the experience of imagined worlds. And when I first got this book, I thought, why is Nick Miser's book, studded with mushrooms on the cover? But then I read the book and I thought, yeah, this is a book coming from the discipline of anthropology. It was some of the research was kickstarted actually as the Dungeons and Dragons dissertation. Back in the 2010s. And again, with the mushrooms, you have this idea of kind of the acid trip, or Hunter S. Thompson Gonzo style journalism, where you go in and experience, bodily what is there. And I would say this is a book that portrays with loving detail the OSR community. That's the old school Renaissance, or a revitalized interest in old school 1980s style charts and tables and dungeon crawling. Um, and so this is again a participant anthropological study. Nick Miser visits Gary Con, in the roots in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and definitely also passionately argues on behalf of Dungeons and Dragons and the importance of play community in shaping the game.
Yeah, and it's yeah, a lot of it is him chronicling his travels and meetings with other gamers and playing their games. And at some point, it feels kind of like bragging, and it goes a lot into this full fanboy mode, and then occasionally switches it up for the theory bits.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that the fanboy mode is maybe fortunately or unfortunately the most enjoyable part of the book, where really you can kind of relax and say, okay, I'm there with Nick and I'm experiencing this the origins of the hobby, as it were, even though again that whole discourse is questionable. Um,
Yeah.
I I think uh, one issue is that since it was in the works for quite a while, again, we kickstarted in the mid 2010s, we already have dead links in the bibliography. Though I discovered this as a problem with my research from 2021 and 2019, right? So maybe hyperlinks being dead is going to be the new normal. Um, and there are also Ernie Gygax, who got kind of canceled recently, plays a role in there. Zach S., who also, in 2019 was finally called out for some very toxic behavior. Um, Alexander Macris is in there, right? So there are some questionable figures who are also sort of circulating through. But I guess you could also say that about the book, some books that we'll review later on as well. Um,
Yeah.
let's see here. I also don't understand what phenomenology is after having read this book, but I'm trying again to reacquaint myself with that literature, and I think this is a prompt for me to care again.
Yeah, I had to read another book on phenomenology, but to understand this book, I'm not sure I still do.
Now, one thing I really, really enjoyed, I don't know if you can see this, but this is this compression of time perspective that it's featured on page 66 of the book. And this actually tells you how a Dungeons and Dragons party has a sort of temporal rhythm of temporal experience. So it charts between resting, exploration, role play, detailed exploration, combat, and breaks. And to some degree, this says there isn't a whole lot of combat. There's actually quite a lot of exploration and role play. And of course, as a GM, I can say this depends greatly on the table. This is one of those things where but at the same time, like I think we could all benefit from doing a few charts of our own sessions to see what or having someone else do it for us, right? To see what it looks like when we run our typical RPG. I like that perspective.
Yeah, but for my part, I like that it pays the Joe Sky tax, which is a thing in the OSR blogosphere, which goes basically that if you yammer on for ages and ages about this some thing that's not useful for gaming directly, then you owe the reader to put in a monster or a magic item or spell or something cool. And this one has a couple of pages of an old-style D&D monster in the back.
Yes, and I think we have some more of that with Bill White's book too. I think
Oh
that
yeah.
I do appreciate the uh that I appreciate the nerddom that comes in because if people's books about poetry can include poems, then our books about RPGs can include RPG material.
Yeah, I think game studies must have some whimsy.
That's right. We deserve our whimsy. But this is a very metal cover, right, for book number 5, Dread Trident by Curtis Carbonell. This indicates that, again, I'm kind of envious of this cover. Just absolutely, stunning romantic imagery. A lone warrior approaching a sunset. Um, Trident tabletop role-playing games and the modern fantastic is approaching it from the discipline of English, and that means again he's returning to role-playing games as literature. And in the book, he's got this notion of the realized fantastic, which basically is a way in which the irrealia, become these kind of building blocks for modern forms of narrative, which I absolutely agree with. Right? If you look at modern television shows and other comics and other forms, they're built on the bones of RPG style narratives, which I think we're only now being able to articulate. So, Carbonell's book is a good entry on that point. Um, I think one thing that this book does fantastically is just explaining the basic core worlds of the RPG fandom. So this is like Dungeons and Dragons, Warhammer, Call of Cthulhu, um, and I'm missing one. Yeah,
It did have a chapter on Eclipse Phase also.
right. Yes, exactly. An Eclipse Phase, which I think Eclipse Phase has lots of academic attention, which is nice. I wish the game were more playable. I just wish. um, but yeah, this is also a legitimation book to some degree. Similar to Schalliger, it's justifying to English that yes, role-playing games are quite interesting, and maybe also Darko Suvin's also in here, where it's legitimating and trying to nail down here are the non-real aspects of role-playing games that nevertheless achieve their kind of temporary reality when we play them.
Yeah, and I absolutely love this book. Also, there's a hell of a lot of continental philosophy in there.
Yes.
Yeah, Derrida and Lacan all make an appearance. This is also the first time I've ever seen anywhere Warhammer 40k and post-structuralist philosophy in the same context, presented as unironically as possible in this era of ours.
Yeah,
It
and
is
it was it
really
was
gold.
it was because of this book that I'm in the Ropecon academic seminar, and I'm actually binding some of the 1970s post-structuralist philosophy to that moment when Dungeons and Dragons was created, and I think Carbonell made that possible, where I can say, you know what, we can just do that because everybody was writing at the same time. Kittler and Baudrillard and Lacan were all writing more or less at the same time as this as this fantasy stuff was emerging from the U.S. and Britain. Um, yeah, I really I enjoyed this as a read. And one thing years ago I thought needed to exist was a book that kind of just explains um, to academics with training, right, in continental philosophy, what makes most of the traded systems um in RPGs work, and the standard world that we play in. So I'm happy that this book exists.
If only it were easier to get.
It's not easy to get. That's right. It is expensive, and we were able to piece it together from various PDFs online. We're moving on to Björn Ola Kam's role-playing games of Japan, which I also have next to me. This is a brilliant work that first of all does not collapse the RPG in the Japan with the JRPG, which is the natural move, right? So really explaining the long history of this activity of role playing in Japan, and in particularly the history of LARP in Japan, or the reasons why Japan did not LARP per se, but now then that culture has been imported in a variety of fascinating ways.
Yeah, but both of our first exposure to Björn Ulrikam was actually the article of Why Japan Does Not LARP in 2011's KP article collection Think LARP. And
Yeah.
actually, didn't the way he explains how LARP became a thing in Japan kind of tied back to the existence of that article?
Yes. There is some origin story in the article itself, but again we have the looming presence of cosplay in Japan that's so much more decisive, and also tabletop RPGs is sort of meaningful and lasting performance. And so when you have a format that's even more intensively scrutinized in Japan than elsewhere, right? They were on sort of the actual play, like play recording, a lot earlier than the West was. I think that uh, there is a very cool holistic picture that emerges and says, okay, LARP maybe wasn't happening, but there were all these other performative role play activities, and maybe that just means our definition of LARP is too narrow.
Yeah, the book also has a lot of discussion of specific people doing stuff, as mediators in bringing role playing games to Japan, spreading them around, bringing Japanese role playing games to Europe and the US. Uh, and he does this thing where he's interviewed people and had them fill out character sheets for themselves in the style of World of Darkness games.
Exactly. Yeah, again, those those bits of role playing game ephemera coming into the text, and I really appreciate those character sheet interludes. Um, Again, we sort of got what we call the JRPG from a collision between Hayao Miyazaki films, so particularly Laputa Castle in the Sky and Dungeons and Dragons. But I think then the book itself chronicles a lot of these, just key people at key positions in various time and how they mediate RPGs, right? So the JRPG was happening in the video game sphere, but meanwhile there were all these authors in the analog sphere, innovating again, things such as play books where you chronicle a session and then you can actually sell your session documentation as its own book, which also has this it sort of it not only immortalizes you, but it also teaches other people how to play the game. It's another teaching tool, and I think that's important because oftentimes we always conceive of our RPGs as being taught one way. You read the rule book and that's it, or the game master teaches it you having read the rule book. And this is another sort of large in-game demonstration that's available and can be read for enjoyment and pleasure.
Yeah. Also, from this book, I learned that there exists a Japanese role-playing game called A Brave Little Rice Cooker, and I now need this in my life.
Yeah. My yeah, I think the Japanese RPGs are wildly original. Tenra Bansho Zero, which is mentioned in the book, has this great NPC chart where whenever you meet an NPC, it is arbitrary how you guys react to each other. And so you have to roll on a chart to see what your general reaction is to the NPC, which means you have this kind of very anime dynamic of like mysterious figure wanders into the room and you're like, I'm instantly in love with them. I hate them. And that just comes from a random table. I mean, it's so sort of off the wall, but also brilliant. And also I recommend Ryutama and Maid, which have also received mention in the book, that these are, again, entries in their own right in the world RPG canon and deserve more play.
Yeah, I have made. I played it. It is certainly very unique.
Yeah, exactly. You can't get that experience anywhere else. Moving on to Bill White, my longtime editing partner. He put out a book called Tabletop RPG Design, Theory and Practice at the Forge, 2001, 2012. Designs and discussions. And this is another one of these really expensive books that's nevertheless, very sought after by the community that it came from, and the indie RPG community. And this articulates the general theories and practices of RPG design, again, as told through this specific internet community called The Forge. And And one thing is, I should note, this is not the book he initially set out to write. He wanted to do an edited collection in which he had a voice and a bunch of other people from the Forge era that have a voice. And he got like one submission and like actual submission for the book. So he decided to turn it around into make it kind of a collection of interviews, some theory again. So where the theory and the interviews kind of clash sometimes, and interrogate what people are saying. And then it also ends with a game that you can play.
which I did. It was
Yay!
fun.
It was fun. So what describe this game real briefly?
Yeah, Design is a Discussion is a game where the players are game designers who discuss their stuff at the Forge during that historical period when Forge existed. And you have your project, and then you put it, you talk about it on the forum, and then the forum reacts to it, and then you burn out. Or you may get a game out.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the Forge was a toxic and hostile space. I was a lurker on there from 2002 on. I could never bring myself to actually post because of the scariness of that forum. But I also thought that, oh well, the games they produced were really cool, and there were things like Vincent Baker's The Lumpley Principle, right, which is again about how what basically RPGs regulate what is said, right? And what is said at the table is more or less what we consider to be the RPG. That Lumpley Principle is actually Ron Edwards from the forum projecting that onto Vincent Baker when he was part of a theory collective with Meg Baker and Emily Care Boss. And so it should have been called the Baker Boss Principle, and that it's now been sort of reframed as that. But Bill White charts that, right? And I think to some degree, we thought there should be like 9 or 10 books on this era. It was very important for the formulation of RPG thought, but at the same time, it's white hot, and people have very strong feelings about it because of the general toxic environment that reigned there.
Oh yeah, but this is an immensely important book since the Forge has been dead for 10 years, about, and not only did nobody at the Forge write that book about the Forge theory, there has been no book. And this is now that history of that specific period of time in role-playing game design, without which we wouldn't have, I think, most of Fate, we wouldn't have Powered by the Apocalypse. It would be a whole different field now.
Yeah, and it was certainly a meeting point of that early indie RPG scene where people refined their ideas, and it really was a turn actually away from theory towards practice, right? The number one thing that was the most important about Forge was you are an independent publisher. You too can make your game. You can make your game focused and better than any major commercial game on the market, and you don't need any theory to tell you about that. So it is frustrating when I see people boiling the Forge down to theory, and I'm like, no, that's almost immediately everyone ran away from that screaming and started publishing their games. So.
Sadly, not everybody. But one thing I think that's valuable here is that it showcases the Forge's culture of argument through game design, which is probably the single good thing about the forum's culture. I mean, the way it's framed in the book is that you had an idea about how role-playing games work, or how the GNS is wrong, and then you made a game that proves your point. Well,
Exactly. And it's important to note that a lot of the games from that era were terrible, but that's because they were not supposed to be playable. They were there to make a point, and and therefore you would always be in this larger theory dialogue through games, which I was very happy to reread. So moving on to the origins of theory, actually, is John Peterson's Elusive Shift from MIT Press, How Role-Playing Games Forged Their Identity. And this documents the early debates in RPGs. and shows us that theory itself, again, what does it mean to role play? What motivates us to do that? How do we resolve conflict? That sort of thing. Um, all of that's been pretty static since the 1970s. And this narrow focus on a very specific period, 1975 to 1980, lets us insert with our brains the later RPG theory debate and say, oh, they were already talking about player motivation theory back then. They were already talking about how much time does certain activities take in the design and what's the role of the game master, etc. So I see this as a celebration of fan knowledge and a deep dive into co-created material over a very limited time. I think actually we need more books that are just about very small, concentrated eras so that they can really be explained in full in this way.
Yeah, this being a John Peterson book, the way he works apparently is that he digs up role-playing game fanzines, many of which are had very small print runs, like sometimes in double digits, uh, and then he goes through them. It's an enormous job, and I'm glad someone's doing it.
Yeah, and he's apparently got the means to do it too, because it's very hard to acquire some of these things, and because it's all become much more collector's items, and since the 2010s began, you really have to be able to go to auctions or whatnot and seize these things, and we all envy his archive in RPG studies.
Yeah, I think he also has access to some university archive that specifically collects fanzines.
So also, I think there's a good thing to point out that this highlights the cyclical nature of RPG discourse. That subculture itself doesn't document itself well, right? So the early scene wasn't self-consciously looking at itself as artists and cultural producers. They were just trying to solve problems at their table or solve basic issues with the form, and in doing that, they actually were confronted with the philosophical issues. Um, and I think what is elusive for me in this book is the elusive shift. It has this extremely suspenseful title that it doesn't really explain until the very end.
I gotta keep the reader reading somehow. Though
Should we
this is
spoil it? I don't know if we should spoil it here. I think people should read the book and then they'll find out what the elusive shift is. What was one thing you saw in this book, Yuka?
I think my favorite bit about this is how it sort of questions D&D's position as the first role-playing game, uh, which is it's arbitrary. And the title might just as easily belong to the British game Western Gunfight or Fight in the Skies, both from the 60s.
Dave Wesley's Brownstein too, right? Where
Oh yeah.
I mean, it is really about the sort of packaging and commercialization, and even the book chronicles of the fact that the role playing game, D&D was fantasy war gaming, and
Mm.
then some people said, okay, if you're calling your fantasy war gaming, we're going to call Tunnels and Trolls and On Guard and these other early RPGs role playing games, and so by end of 1975. TSR was saying, "Oh yeah, D&D is a RPG too, right?" And it's just this sort of business language maneuvering, and has everything to do with trying to sell your books and nothing to do with the precision of the language.
Yeah, wasn't the first game to actually call itself a role-playing game Tunnels and Trolls?
Yes, it was Tunnels and Trolls, and Tunnels and Trolls was trying to distinguish itself from D&D and ended up making D&D into a role-playing game by doing that, because then D&D wanted to have Tunnels and Trolls as market. Okay, we've got a few more minutes here. So we've got Michal Mochaki's Roleplay as Heritage Practice, historical LARP, tabletop RPG, and reenactment. And this is a book that really bridges between game studies, heritage studies, and academic history communities. Gosh, this book, what it does is it really validates about a decade worth of European-based academic RPG conversations. I'm in the book, and Bill's in the book, and our whole, when we had the 2012 role playing in games seminar at Tampere, Mikhail was there, and other people he cites were there. So I really feel like I feel at home when I read this book. Like, oh, now our discourse is being put in dialogue with the historical reenactment discourse, etc.
Hell, even I'm in the book.
You're even in the book, exactly. So congrats, Mikhail, for including us and for putting us in the conversation. And now I feel like I can say something to those Civil War reenactment people here in the States. And finally, we've got Stephanie Hedge and Jennifer Jennifer Gruhling's role playing in the digital age. This is came out this year, and this is a edited collection of essays on streaming as well as non-streamed, pre-recorded RPGs and all of the communities and practices around those things. So this is about, not only playing role-playing games online, but what are the effects of that? And also, it has quite a few interviews with people from from the actual community of practice.
Yeah, and it also discusses in many articles just playing role-playing games online without any streaming or recording, and stuff like Roll20.
Yeah.
And this is fascinating because it came out this March, but of course books take time to produce. This is current to for maybe early 2020. So just before the thing happened and the whole online gaming ecosystem and the scene changed completely.
Right. So exactly. This is a snapshot of 2019. Absolutely. I'd say this is coming from a North American English perspective as well as from fan studies. Again, including the community of practice in there, but then also they're not too concerned with bridging to other discourse communities such as the Nordic role playing discourse, for example. My favorite article in this collection is by far Emily Friedman's on the origins of Critical Role, and partially it's just on Vox Machina, right? Before that campaign was recorded and shown, there were many hours of an initial campaign that has all this like cloak of legend, and if you watch the video of that, you realize immediately this is all standard D&D, meet in a tavern crap. You go into a dungeon, there's an end boss. Once you beat the end boss, there's like a question about what's linking this dungeon to the next dungeon, and they wind up in a tavern. But it's been like elevated to the level of kind of mythic culture by the fact that Critical Role is a multi-million-dollar franchise. So I thought, man, this is weird, but Emily Friedman's piece really holds us in the weirdness.
Personally, my favorite piece in the book is an essay, I cannot remember by whom, but about people who are, for various reasons, excluded from participating in online play because of money or other limitations.
Yeah. And I think that's a huge factor too, that we actually need this massive apparatus and also a number of cultural and textual affordances in order to get to a certain level of online play. So it's not really for everybody, and that can be a problem when we are all isolated at home trying to play games with each other. Well, we've reached the end of our time. We have actually covered 10 books within an hour. And I want to, again, thank my partner here, Jukka, for marching through these with me at a rapid pace. But then also I want to thank the Ropecon audience and general internet audience, whoever might find this video buried in an internet trash bin years later. All of this is possible because of your attention.
Thank you. for participating in this. And thank you, Ropecon.